Welcome to the Streets and People podcast presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. Get Around Cabo Car Free is a volunteer community movement advocating for more transport options for people who can't drive in Caboolture and Morayfield in Queensland. In today's podcast, we'll be covering one of these three broad topics. It might be Road Rules 360, where we discuss Queensland's road rules, the legislation, the design for people walking, biking, in wheelchairs or on a scooter. It might be Not Everyone Drives, where we chat with people whose transport options don't include a car in a car-dependent society. And it might be People and Projects, where our conversations are with people working on a specific aspect of inclusive transportation. Today we're doing one of our People and Projects episodes, and I'm here with Richard Buning. I met you, Richard, at the Asia Pacific Bike Riding Conference. That was in Brisbane earlier on this year. I'm here in Gubbi Gubbi country in Caboolture. Richard, whereabouts are you?
That was a great conference. Great to meet you there. I'm working at home today from West End, but I work at the University of Queensland Business School, the St. Lucia campus, and I work in the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I am a senior lecturer in our tourism discipline. I'm also the research lead for the UQ Micromobility Research Cluster, which is a group of interdisciplinary scholars across geography, urban planning, transport, business, and marketing that are researching active transport and micromobility.
I think you did a presentation on tourism and scooters, and I thought it was actually a really useful way of thinking about scooters, because as somebody who has been in different countries at different times and visited, I've thought, yeah, you walk, and for me as a woman, often personal safety is a big issue. So I don't know if I'm going to get into an area where I feel like, oh, is this some place where I really want to be, and how quick can I exit? I was really struck by how useful it would be a scooter. I've never been on a scooter, and actually my bike was stolen yesterday, and I have a friend who's lending me a scooter, and I'll see what it's like because I've never ridden on a scooter before. They're clearly very popular. I see them in Brisbane. Perhaps you can explain what is beneficial about e-scooters. Why would you choose e-scooter hire for tourists, or maybe e-bike hire for tourists, or do they work for different audiences?
I've been researching the cycling industry for nearly 15 years, my entire academic career, primarily around tourism. Half of my work has really been focused on people traveling to cities, destinations, countries to ride their bike as a type of cycling tourism. But traditionally, before in the past, if you were a tourist in a city, in a community, and you wanted to explore that community, that city, probably an urban area, and you wanted to ride a bike, you were really limited. You had to go to a bike hire shop or a bike shop, find one in the first place, may not be that convenient to where you're staying, then sign off some information, give them an ID, perhaps make a deposit of some sort, and then rent the bike for a specified amount of time, a day or two, and then have to return that bike back to that brick and mortar bike shop. And lots of communities didn't even have anything like that. But if you were to go to a place like Amsterdam, that's usually how it works. But with the invention of bike share and then the dockless bikes, now dockless e-scooters, it's never been easier ever for tourists to use active transport to get around cities using bikes and scooters. Before, if you were a tourist, you were really just stuck to walking. In the modern day rideshare, because tourists often don't really like using public transport, they find it quite confusing, potentially scary, especially when bus schedules are difficult to understand. You don't know necessarily where you're going to go when you get on one, how you can pay for it. Lots of cities, you have to have a transport card, like in Brisbane, we have the Go card, which is slowly being phased out, but still is a big barrier to having to be able to pay for it in the first place. Tourists just don't really use public transport. Then they're just kind of stuck on walking, and walking's pretty limited. There's tourism research that says most folks, if they have to walk, they stay, 1 to 5 kilometers away from where they're staying, because, walking's difficult, and especially in our tropical climate where it's really hot, it's even more limited. But when you get tourists on bikes and scooters, you have this great benefit to everyone. You give them the best possible experience they could ever imagine. They get to do more and see more, and they get to stop at all kinds of different places. You're not stuck in a car. You're not stuck navigating public transport, and you're not limited about how far you can walk. And what tourists want to do, they're not like residents. They're not trying in a rush to get somewhere often. They want to see and experience the destination. They want to take pictures. They want to take it all in. They want to slow down. They want to look at everything. They want to read plaques. They want to look at monuments. They want to have a group experience. Usually people are traveling with other friends or family or a couple, and they want to have this great story from their tourist experience. And when you're stuck in a car, or you're stuck in traffic, or you're on a bus, you don't having that experience just by purely through transport. You're getting transported around to those different experiences. But when we put tourists on bikes and scooters, we allow them to have their transport to simply be perhaps one of the most memorable experiences they would have in visiting that place. It really benefits the local community and the tourism industry because there's research from Townsville done with Neuron with some of my colleagues from Griffith that tells us that when tourists are on e-scooters or e-bikes, they spend their money more widely across the community and they spend more money because it's just simply easier to stop at a cafe or a restaurant or a bar or a local shop to stop, go in, buy something, and move on. There's been research by several of the companies that say lots of the trips on e-scooters and e-bikes end with purchases at different local establishments. It doesn't include a bunch of people more into creating congestion, right? For residents, we want to get someplace quickly often, and we want to do it with the least hassle as possible. But for the tourists, they don't really care about that as much. They want an experience more than anything. And if we get them out of cars, that's less people in cars blocking up the roads for everyone else trying to get to work and so on. Another thing is for the providers of e-scooters, e-bikes, these companies, it is a huge market share for them. I did a study in Indianapolis on the bike share program there, and we found about a third of all users of micromobility are tourists. So even for the companies themselves, tourists provide a big market share. Tourists ride the bikes or ride the scooters for almost twice as long, and they take longer in distance and longer in time because they take slower rides. They stop. They're not hurrying around as much. They want to slow down, take a photo, look at something, or stop at a shop, compared to the resident that's just trying to get hurried to get to class or get to work or the grocery store or whatever. So I think it makes the best benefit to the tourists themselves, the local industry, helps out the local community or annoys local residents the least with less traffic. And it provides a big piece of business opportunity for the providers of these services.
If you've got tourists and you've got a scooter and an e-bike, do they prefer one to the other? And how do you navigate your way on those? So say you go, I want to go to this place. I've looked up on one of the tourist sites and they say, go to this place and I can see it. Is there a stand on the e-bike or e-scooter to be able to check your mobile phone?
First, about the e-scooter e-bike comparison. From the research we did in 2023 with Brisbane City Council, I also did another project on wayfinding with Lime about 4 years ago. We did a big survey of their users. And we really found that for ease of use or convenience with riding an e-scooter compared to an e-bike, in that people just think it's easier. There's a big barrier to riding a bike, and it's knowing how to ride a bike. But with an e-scooter, basically most people that are physically able think they can ride one at least, or are willing to give it a go. If you don't know how to ride a bike, you're probably a bit scared to ride a bike. People thought the e-scooters were just more nimble around the city. They're obviously easier to park because they're smaller, easier to kind of navigate all of the different types of obstacles that we have in the city. Trying to get them off footpaths, but people still do ride them on footpaths, are tons of obstacles. There's street furniture, pedestrians, dogs, bus stops, signs, benches, and this uneven quality of surface, grates and all those types of things. And they're just a bit easier. If you have the zigzag around thing, that people think that they're easier on the scooters. The problem with scooters is, I think for most folks, is they don't carry much. They don't have a basket, feel a little less utilitarian. Because of that, people think e-bikes are a little bit more utilitarian. You could carry things around with you if you need to. Better suited for longer distances, where people think the e-scooter is better for a shorter distance. And the e-bikes are just a bit bigger, a bit more difficult to park compared to an e-scooter, or more navigating obstacles and things like that. And you just have to have that innate ability to know how to ride one in the first place. While we've seen so many more e-scooters on the streets, most cities where both shared e-scooters and shared e-bikes operate, and that the shared e-scooters just generate more trips because they're more popular in that sense for those short trips people are taking.
Two things out of that. I read some research, I think it was yesterday, that talked about why Melbourne withdrew scooters and what was the sort of user experience, and did that make a difference? I think they surveyed 500 people, and it turned out that the main issue was lack of infrastructure for scooters, and that caused the problems of people parking them where they shouldn't, people being on footpaths where they shouldn't. So that's one of the controversies about e-scooters. What are some of the others? Some cities have now been banned because they've said they have not nearly as many scooters as they had in reality, and then they got removed from Melbourne, and some of the tensions between pedestrians and scooter people and bicycles and drivers. Let's just put it out there. What are the problems? What are the perceptions? What's the difference between the perception and the reality?
Yeah, parking has been kind of one of the most consistent issues with the shared e-scooters over the years, basically all cities. Something to consider is that the devices that are on the road, the shared ones, they are like the early iPhone compared to the iPhone that we have today. The first Lime devices we had in the streets in Brisbane compared to the more modern e-scooters that Lime is operating today, they're almost completely different, right? They're so much safer, suspension, bigger front wheels, better technology, better brakes, better app technology, better geofencing, bigger antennas. They have sharper GPS awareness. So the technology and the devices have been increasingly improving every single year. And having different companies compete against that has really helped. For example, if you remember when they first came to Brisbane, the Brisbane area, all the helmets were just kind of hanging on the handlebars all over them, and they ended up literally everywhere. A couple of years ago in Brisbane, Beam and Neuron, they created the Bluetooth helmet lock in Brisbane. So now they use Bluetooth from your phone to unlock the helmet from the device. So now the helmets are connected to the device. So things like that have really changed. So these kind of technological and device innovations that will continue to happen if communities keep investing in them. The parking thing is interesting because it is an area that has gotten much better. It's half infrastructure, having a place for them to park, half technology-based solution. And part of that is with the app, they can create and decide where vehicles get parked. In some communities, they were running it in the Sunshine Coast where you could only park in certain zones, or you could only park a scooter in a specific area based on GPS location. That's one way where you can not have that free-floating parking problem. In Melbourne, I think you could just park them wherever you want, as long as they were in not a no parking zone, which is just like limited parts of the city, not requiring them to be parked in a specific area. What's coming in the future in that space that we're going to see in Brisbane, probably within the next year or so, is parking locations in urban areas and CBD areas. Because the problem in CBD areas is there's all kinds of buildings which create problems and noise with GPS signals, which make them less accurate. The new thing is having beacons on the devices. Basically, it'll require that device to be parked in a specific parking area based on a beacon that is being connected to that parking zone. It's partially the city building parking spaces. In Brisbane, we built a lot of parking spaces where the parking hubs used to be. The slight problem with that, it's probably a good thing to have required parking area, especially in heavy CBD areas, but it does make the convenience of the user experience of them a little bit worse because then you may have to park. If you remember riding city cycles around, how often would you ride a bike, try to park it at one station, there'd be like all these full bikes, and you ride it back to another one, that would be full bikes, then you ride it back to another one, and by the time you'd be walking 20 minutes from where you had to park the bike. Other controversies, obviously safety with not just even the users of them, but safety with collisions of other pedestrians has been a massive problem. Some really bad incidents have occurred where people have been kind of walking out of shop fronts over the years and have been collided with the scooter, which is quite a problem, but it has improved, and the road rules and compliance around it have helped as well, because now in Queensland, the speed limit is 12 kilometers an hour on sidewalks. That's not really being heavily enforced that well, or I'm not sure most users really even know that that's the speed limit, but it's just a matter is that people are not looking for fast moving objects on footpaths. Pedestrians, you don't step out of a shop front and look left and right most of the time like you do look left and right when you cross the street and you're looking for a car. Other controversies, there's a fair few. Safety, parking, collisions with usually pedestrians, or a lot of the e-scooter accidents are usually actually happening not related to cars. They're happening just e-scooter rider by themselves.
One of the companies said that they had X number of scooters and then it turned out they had a whole lot more. If you know anything about that, perhaps speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it was really unfortunate news to hear. I don't think anyone in the industry was excited to hear it, but ultimately it is just kind of the outcome of one company, not necessarily, I think, a reflection of the industry at all whatsoever. But essentially what the allegations are is that it does look pretty convincing, as they've a whistleblower has exposed internal Slack messages about the program. All the different shared providers in every single city have an agreement with that council to operate a specific number of vehicles on the road. There's kind of a sweet spot in the number of vehicles that are on the road. Too few and they're not convenient convenient enough. They're not usable enough because people can't find them. Really, the main reason people use them is convenience because they're easier to use than driving in public transport and such. And too many, they become too annoying, right? Because there's too many of them parked everywhere, too cluttered. The parking issue becomes more of a problem. There's a kind of a sweet spot for basically every city on the number of ones that should be out there on the street. And different councils have different fee arrangements. Brisbane City Council originally, I think the agreement was based on number of vehicles that were operating. But I think most councils have switched that to the providers pay a fee to that council based on the trips that a scooter takes, which has kind of been a shift in the industry a bit on how those provider fees are paid to councils. But at any given point, some number of those devices that are on the street are going to be damaged, right? Have a flat tire or break or something. To get those fixed, they operate rangers, people that drive around vans. A user flags that it doesn't work. They pick up the broken vehicle, take it back to their shop and fix it. Basically, the controversy was that Beam was operating secretly more vehicles, seemed like some sort of proportion perhaps on the number of vehicles that were allowed in that council originally than they were supposed to. What's in the media and what's out there is that they denied that it was anything related to making profit, but the councils are jumping off because they feel quite deceived by them and they feel that it was really related to them wanting to have more scooters, devices, vehicles out there to basically create a larger profit and hide some of their use away from paying the fees to those councils.
You may not know the answer to this, but I was thinking as you were speaking, so if you have hire cars, do hire car companies have to rent? Is there an allocation that they get from the council about too many or too few? Are there any restrictions on hire cars and how many there can be and which company can provide them? Is there a fee that they then have to pay for a car to the council? So I guess my question is this just like a special weird rule for scooters that doesn't apply to cars when, well, if we're all talking about transport, then it goes across the board, irrespective of the mode?
We don't really look at cars. People don't really judge cars that much. We don't really look at parking spaces in a critical way. We don't look at streets and go, oh, look at all these parking spaces are taking up all this space. Or you don't look at a big parking lot and go, oh, look at that room. There could be a park over there. People don't consider those types of things. And it even comes to the point where with vehicle deaths, with vehicle accidents. When you see a vehicle accident in the news, I don't think people really react to it too much other than, oh, okay. Or, oh, this is creating me traffic, I think, to that degree. But when it comes to a cyclist or a scooter accident or a cyclist or scooter death, that usually gets portrayed in much more of a controversial type of way. But we spend a lot of effort, energy, public transport funding on policing vehicles, as you would know, licensing programs, enforcement, roads, all of that stuff. Unfortunately, bikes, scooters don't get that same level of treatment or acknowledgement or consideration for public and just generally transport agencies in general and the way that cars do. Both good and bad. We don't license folks to ride or own a scooter, but we also don't provide the type of infrastructure that we do to those devices like we do cars.
And it often strikes me that lack of infrastructure for bikes, scooters, mobility scooters, the four-wheel ones that people with disabilities have, that is all lacking. There is this real middle path there between being on a foot, on a slow, plod, 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 which I'm doing now that my bike is stolen. I'm doing a lot of that at the moment, going, gosh, it takes a long time to get anywhere. And then, vroom, 60 kilometers an hour, 50 kilometers an hour somewhere. And there is this middle space, and that space has been so neglected for such 100 years. How do we forge that space back out again onto the landscape? Now, your area of specialization is actually tourism, and Caboolture is on the outskirts. It's beautiful here. It's so beautiful. One of our guests, Phil Latz, he said, you've got Caboolture River there. You should get a bike path along there, and that will encourage bike users. We don't sort of see that Caboolture is tourist possible. If a listener is at council, say, or somebody's listening to it and thinking, my business would really be developed by having scooters and bikes, hire scooters for tourism, how do we make it a tourist place? I'm thinking about e-bikes and e-scooters. So what can you suggest that we do to make it tourist favorable?
To make it tourist favorable, that's a big question. For tourists to use e-scooters and e-bikes, they need to be convenient to where they're staying and to the hotel and accommodation, and or potentially some sort of transport hub that they could more easily get to. In smaller communities where we have communities that have poor public transport, lower frequency of services, or maybe even more rural communities where there is no public transport, Bribey Island, where you just have to walk or drive to get around there, really. It's e-scooters, e-bikes fill a completely different purpose almost in those spaces. Is that in cities, we say that they are like the public mobility glue and that they connect cars, bikes, buses all together, right? They fill in all the spaces. But in those kind of more outreaching communities where public transport is a little bit more of a problem, they serve a place where they basically just completely replace renting a car or having to drive somewhere altogether because there is no other option of riding a bus or riding a train somewhere. So I think for those types of communities, they even potentially play a bigger role in helping people get around. But the thing you always have to consider with tourists is tourists always have a problem with wayfinding and getting around, and they get lost. I did a research project with Lime a few years ago. We were surveying and interviewing a bunch of their users about wayfinding in cities, primarily tourists. And we were finding they were getting lost. A lot of the new devices have a mount for your phone, so you could put your phone on there and have Google Maps or something running. Doesn't necessarily always give you the best route using low traffic roads and such to ride a bike or ride a scooter. We talked to one guy and he ended up on the freeway because he thought he was on a bike path, and all of a sudden he was on the highway on a Lime scooter. It really speaks to also the users that we spoke to, non-users in Brisbane in 2023. If a tourist finds a path, finds a cycling infrastructure, they're just going to follow it and see where it goes. Likely if they're on a bike or a scooter. Perhaps if they see a signed route, we don't really have much of those in our area. In Brisbane, we have the River Loop. A signed route helps as well too, because tourists really want visual wayfinding. Looking at a Google map helps, but in areas where you don't have great walking and cycling infrastructure, people are still riding bikes in those places. I always refer to these people like as cycling ninjas that, they know all the best ways. They know how to go on the back roads and the back streets, and they'll be on this neighborhood road and this neighborhood road, and they jump on that sidewalk and they take that trail. So they find creative ways to get out of the way of cars, but tourists don't know how to do that. They're pretty much lost most of the time they're getting around or looking for big clues, visual wayfinding signs. But the best scenario is a path or a route or even a shared sidewalk, perhaps, that they can just follow that takes them to all the good places that they want to go and all the places that your community has to showcase. So highly agree with Phil. If you had a great path up there, that would certainly unlock it. Some of those paths like rail trails even serve as a destination in and of their own for cycling tourism, for people to go there just to ride their bike or scooter.
That's actually really good because we have the Caboolture to Wamuran rail trail and there are a lot of people who use it. It's just 8.5 kilometres, but it goes from Beerburrum Road into Wamuran and there's a little park there at the end. And it never occurred to me that that would be a tourist destination. I mean, yeah, we get people come from Brisbane, but I never think of that as being tourism. And of course, it's tourism. When you come out of Caboolture Station, you're on the footpath, you go past some schools, and it doesn't feel safe because you've got Beerburrum Road, which is a big, horrible road. Very unpleasant. I guess joining Caboolture Station with the Wamuran Rail Trail, making that more pleasant and some good wayfaring, just that would increase usability of the Wamuran Rail Trail quite substantially. This is what I'm hearing from what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Connections are so important. Google Maps helps, and it's gotten much better on kind of showing you where a cycling infrastructure is, or a bike path is, or a low traffic road is. It's getting better. Tourists could be on one street away riding their bike in a busy road, and 2 streets over there could be the nicest bike path you've ever seen in your life, but they may not know it's there. And those visual clues, signage, connectivity in the ways that tourists want to experience these places. Tourists want to see rivers, they want to see statues, they want to go to local businesses, they want to go to coffee shops and breweries and restaurants and local stores and different attractions and such. So thinking about where those things are, what are the attractive parts of your community, or maybe it's a beach or whatever it might be, or natural scenic area. Connecting those places together with cycling infrastructure is a win. It gives tourists a really easy way to experience your local area, but it also helps local businesses know where tourists are going to be and provides them the best experiences. There are lots of communities out there across the world that have tons and tons and tons of great attractions, but tourists may never even find them. I think often about in Brisbane, because I live in West End. I think West End's one of like the best cultural neighborhoods of our city, and I think it's one of the most iconic places probably to visit, I would say, in the city. And it's a very authentic kind of real place to visit compared to maybe like the more commercialized type of feel of the CBD. And CBDs, to me, I don't know, they all kind of feel somewhat similar to me in a little bit. Our CBD is pretty nice because we have big trees and things, but tourists don't get out into those different areas because they don't know that they're there necessarily, and they wouldn't know how to get there necessarily if they even knew that they were there. Pass, sign routes, making it really easy. You really have to dumb it down for tourists in terms of wayfinding to get them to places.
I don't normally talk about what happens outside Caboolture. There's obviously a lot of people on Bribie Island, you've just mentioned, and there's a big problem getting transport from Caboolture Station to Bribie Island. And there's a bus service, but it's so not great. And it stops, I think, at 6:30 or something. You finish work at, I don't know, 6. By the time you get down to the station, 6:30, arrive at Caboolture, that's it. You're sort of stuck there. For instance, my bike was stolen near the station yesterday and I had to walk. And as a woman on my own at 8:15 in the evening, it was really unpleasant and quite scary. I'm just thinking about Caboolture to Bribie Island. Now, that's quite a destination. I don't know how many kilometres that is. That is a bit of a destination. But I'm wondering if those vehicles actually might be a possibility to go between, say, Caboolture to Bribie Island, and you have them as a tourist thing at Bribie Island.
Absolutely. I think out in Bribie, I've been curious about them. I've been out there several times as a tourist, and getting there is a challenge. If you don't have a car, it seems like you basically can't get there at all. But then once you're there, you're almost entirely car dependent to get around, which is unfortunate because the island has a really wide shared paths almost all the way around it. Unless you've brought your own bike, which most tourists, unless you're like a local tourist that drove there with their own bikes, isn't going to have one. You're really, really stuck on driving around, which means you're missing everything in between. You might be staying out in the middle of the island and you want to drive to the beach. So that means everything that you've driven past, you've missed all those experiences. You've missed taking pictures. You've missed going into those shops and so on, and making the whole kind of transport experience great. That personal safety, I think I want to like to touch on that. I definitely think that's generally a big appeal of riding a bike, or now this bigger term of e-scooters, micromobility, especially in the post kind of COVID world, of that people were getting more onto bikes because they didn't want to be in a car. They didn't want to have to touch other surfaces. They didn't want to have to be in a crowded bus. And then just personal safety in general. I'm sure most folks that are regular public transport commuters have probably been on a train or a bus and probably felt uncomfortable at some point from some of their passenger that's on there. And when you think, if you're on a bike or you're on a scooter and you're in charge of your own kind of public transport, you're in charge of your own transport needs, it puts you in a better place, better control to take charge of that yourself, and that you can more freely move around that area instead of being kind of necessarily stuck in a car with someone or stuck on some bus or someone that you don't necessarily want to be with. I think that is a kind of a big draw for some folks to get into micromobility or riding scooters or bikes more so, is that they aren't so stuck into some tight area and some place they don't want to be.
So we're heading up towards the end there. The council doesn't currently have a policy for shared hire scooters. Say Bribie Island, they want to get e-scooters and e-bikes because they go, oh yeah, this would be actually really good. What could they do to encourage the council? How would they go about it?
I think it's worth mentioning that there's a couple different models in the way that the shared devices are run. The model that basically everyone really knows is the type of model that runs in Brisbane. Those types of things is where that they have a contract with the council. The shared provider pays a fee based on usage to that council to then operate in the city. That fee is basically, but primarily, for them to be parked on different public spaces in the city. Because in most cities where there's no shared program on Bribie Island, but private e-scooters are still legal in Queensland. So you can still operate a scooter. It's not illegal to operate a scooter or park a scooter, but for a shared device to be parked on public infrastructure, that's why you need that council agreement. But in other areas, in Noosa, I know in Port Douglas, they have it this way. I think it was in Cairns as well. There's another model where shared providers or companies won't have an agreement with the council, and they will just have agreements with local or private properties, primarily hotels, or it could be a restaurant or something like that, that has a space for scooters to be parked. And in that way, they don't actually pay a fee to the council at all. And they just pay a fee probably to that hotel or accommodation provider to then park the devices on that private property. Some councils have been pretty upset with that because they feel like it's kind of skirting their approval and they have less control over it. I think some councils also really look at shared devices as a way to like bring in extra revenue, help their budgets out because they pay that fee to them. But there is this model where you can just run them from hotels. Plenty of hotels around the world will have a program where they have free bikes you can use. The same thing could be where a hotel has a shared e-scooter service that they run, and you're allowed to park that e-scooter at other various tourism attractions across the city. There are other kind of solutions. Those solutions kind of work better for tourists because, you'd have it at your hotel where you'd be staying and then you could ride it to one of the attractions you're going to, another attraction, and so on. There are different models out there operating that's worth noting.
Yeah, that's great. We are coming up to the end of time, so it's been a fantastic conversation. Before we close out, is there anything else you would like to share or add?
I think it's largely a misperception around especially shared e-scooters or private e-scooters as well. One of the big ones is that we don't really differentiate between public and private e-scooters much at all. The shared e-scooters are the most controlled vehicle that's on the road. They're speed limited. They have a really competitive in making quality brakes, tires, wheels, safety measures and such. We can literally prevent them from going from certain areas to other areas. If we were allowed to control cars like that, we'd have much safer streets if we actually were able to make cars not go certain speeds in certain zones. And that's what the shared devices are. It's pretty easy in the private scooters to break the speed limiters on them and to ride fast. So I think we kind of mix these two in together, and that private public scooters, public doesn't really differentiate between. But I know that they can be kind of a scary thing, but I think there is quite a negativity bias around them. You might see one young person being a bit of a nuisance on a shared scooter, someone drink riding on a scooter. You might see that once, and you're just going to go, those things are awful. All the other people that just rode them, abided by the laws, went to work, didn't make traffic, had a great experience, or had a nice afternoon with their kids, like exploring a city. Those stories go really unnoticed, especially I think in the media and public perception, and that when people are using them right, we don't really notice it as much. And we don't really tell those stories as frequently as when we see that bad annoying person. When it comes to cars, how often have you seen someone drive annoyingly on a car in the road? How often do you get cut off by someone in your car? Or how often does someone give you the bird or something like that? We don't tell those people that we should ban all cars because of these poor drivers, right? We have enforcement around it. I hope in the future, the vehicles, the technology will improve, our cities will improve at better adopting them, but I do think they have quite a place to stay in our urban transport mixes.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a great conversation. I have really enjoyed it. I've really gotten a much better idea about e-scooters and tourism. And basically, I think in Caboolture, we don't really have that opportunity here, but certainly areas nearby like Redcliffe, there's plenty of places around Moreton where actually they would be really good bribey and really solve a unique problem. So that's great. Well, thank you very much. And it's been great having you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Big fan of everything you're doing.
Thanks for enjoying Streets and People presented by Get Around Cabo Car Free. We publish our podcast regularly at the usual places and on our website where you can find out more about us. getaroundcabocarfree.com.au. That's www.getaround, get around, that's pretty straightforward. Cabo, C-A-B-O, that's short for Caboolture. Car Free, C-A-R-F-R-E-E. There's no hyphen in that. .com.au. Our theme music is The Thief on AM Sound, which is just like our cars on our streets, always stealing the space. So let's stop that thief.